Hello, I'm Alice Bloom, here today for the Larchmont-Mamaroneck League of Women Voters. Today we bring you the fourth in our information series on U.S. immigration policy. Our expert, Dr. David Blank, former chief economist for CBS. Our topic, immigration from a global and economic perspective. Stay with us for what I promise will be a very interesting conversation.
The problem with old ministers is they don't die, they just go on and on and on. But I did find this in the New York Times, and I want you to open it now. It says, do not open, you have permission to open it. And it's, maybe you saw this a few weeks ago, November 3rd. And these are people coming back from their tour of duty in Iraq, kissing the ground. And it brought a smile to my face, and it also gave me pause to think of what it would be like to be separated for 15 months from family, from friends, to be in an outpost far in the desert and just in conditions that are just awful and be in harm's way. And so as I looked at this, I just felt, well, maybe I'll share this with you this morning. And as I wanted to speak about, just for a second here, on Pearl Harbor, James Brady, who wrote that book on Iwo Jima, and I guess he was a resident of Rye, he may still be, but he said his father never really talked about the war. And when they brought up the fact about, and of course late in his life, he finally realized that his father was one of these people that was extremely important in that particular battle. And his father said this, he says, I'm not a hero, the real heroes never came back. And in a certain sense, it's true. And when I thought I had, gee, you're asking me to talk about Pearl Harbor. I wasn't even born. But it's a day that Roosevelt said would live in infamy. And as I went on and did some research about it, I happened to see the actual footage of the Arizona going down. And when the Arizona went down, 1,177 people went down with it, entombed. And today, if you go to Hawaii, which I've done actually, and gone to that memorial, which looks like a, from a distance, it looks a little crazy. It looks like, as someone said, it was a milk carton set like this over it. When you walked on there, and as I did a few years ago, all of a sudden everybody there became quiet. And there was a sort of a sense of reverence that came over and empowered everyone that was there. It was just a moving experience. And I wondered, because crowds and crowds are waiting to go and to see this particular place. And once you get on, they ask you to be quiet, but all of a sudden, boom, a chill took over the entire place, and everyone was respectful. A totally different climate took place. And as you look down, you can actually see oil seeping up from that particular ruin. And actually, there's some questions about ecologically what to do about that particular thing, but it's a reminder of this grave that's only 8 foot beneath you as you walk over this particular. And from a distance, you can see the Missouri, where the peace accords were signed with Japan at that time. But 2 hours took place. In those 2 hours, thousands of Americans died. Our fleet was decimated, and it was a day that lived in infamy, I think, for all of us. The only thing I wanted to say is not only that this commands a sense of reverence, we might not have any wars at all if we could draft everybody over 40, but unfortunately that's not quite the case. And, but I will say one thing. As Arthur Ashe said when he was dying, and he wrote this book called The Days of Grace, he simply put it this way. He said, even though I have not much time to live, every moment that I have, I want to walk into a room and be able to change the climate in that room, especially if things are going south or going bad. And I think that's really the inspiration for all of us when we walk into a room to take a situation, to be able, by who we are, to change a climate. Whether it's a little child struggling with their homework and just putting your arms on that child's back and saying, hey, we can get through this. I can help you with your homework. even though it seems overpowering to you, or whether it's in a controversial situation here in Mamaroneck over something, to come in and to try to change the direction, saying that we can solve this problem, we can move forward, we can make a difference. And so today, I didn't find much note of it. I couldn't find anything in the New York Times, although I had to sleep this morning searching through it desperately for material. I'm not sure it was even mentioned today in the New York Times.
I didn't see it on the front page of the Journal.
It's in the Larchmont Gazette.
Hey, there we go.
An
There we
article
go.
and a beautiful picture. I mean, it's an amazing picture. I should say beautiful.
So-
NPR had a talk this morning. That was coming here.
Great, great. Nice to hear that. And I might have gone on notice with me actually, because I wasn't given this assignment. So, but anyhow, I thought what we might just do for a moment is just for 1 minute, just have a moment of silence. That'll be it. Okay. Hope I didn't go too long here. I'll never get invited back. Let's just pause. Thank you. I'm going to join the rest of you in another spot. While I'll be here, I might have to sneak out a little earlier. I'm not
We
sure.
understand. We hope you come back frequently, now that you've found us.
I know where you are.
All right, our guest today really is an inspiring man. Dr. David Blank, former chief economist for CBS. In retirement, he just is teaching economics at Westchester Community College. I've given him an assignment too. People seem to take it. My kids never took my assignments. I don't understand. My husband doesn't take assignments. But I've asked him to lead us in a conversation about immigration with an economic and global perspective. We'll briefly frame some questions. I've asked him to talk for about 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll open for your questions and comments. Dr. Blank.
To continue the thought that we just heard, I spent 4 years in the Army in World War II, 2 years in Europe, and I moved to France and Germany. And one important difference then and now is that I'm amazed at the ability of soldiers in Iraq to talk with their families on cell phones, emails, and they can constant conversation. We never had that opportunity. So we were coming back from Europe. I left from Marseille. We landed in Norfolk, and everybody grabbed their duffel bags and ran to the barracks, dumped their duffel bags on their cot, and ran to the nearest payphone. The line was, very long. And after about 30 minutes, I finally got to the payphone and dialed my home telephone, and nobody was home. I got to them later that night, but that was a very strange moment. I couldn't get anybody. Okay. I've been asked to add to your conversation about immigration. We are looking at the largest migration of people across national boundaries in recorded history throughout the world. None of the problems or issues or opportunities in the United States are not unique. They're very similar to those facing a lot of other countries in the world. With a couple of major exceptions, the mass migration is simply an effort on the part of poor people to raise their standard of living and their family standard. The exceptions, of course, are in sub-Saharan Africa, where there are civil wars that compel people to escape, except for the Zimbabweans who are really running away from
Talk a little about it.
the Zimbabweans who are really running away from a disastrous economy where inflation rates are something like 15,000% a year. And I guess the 2 million Iraqis that have left because of their terrible problems. The rest of the migration is essentially an economic migration where poor people, as they have sometimes done in the past, but not as much as now, are seeking to improve their lives. In Asia, there are modest amounts of this kind of mass migration. There are countries, for example, there are countries in the Arab Emirates where 90% of the population are not residents, not citizens. There are countries like the Philippines where people are trained to go overseas and take jobs in other countries and send remittances back. A lot of Filipino nurses in this country, a lot of Filipino nannies in Egypt. In Europe, where movements are really comparable to the movements in this country, so much to my surprise, I've seen stories that people think that the movements are even larger in Europe than they are here. There are two kinds of immigration in Europe. Two kinds of migration in Europe. One consists of migration within the European Union. When the European Union was founded and they abolished barriers to movements of goods and services and people, I don't think they had any conception of what they were getting themselves into. Their idea, I think, of people moving across boundaries were people on vacation, business people going to another country to transact business and going back to their home country. But that's not what's happened in recent years. What's happened in recent years, there are large movements of population within the European Union. There are 500,000 Poles in England, right, Britain, right? And that, they've welcomed those. Not every country has welcomed that migration. Sarkozy, when he was running for president of France, commented on the fact that there are 200,000 young French men and women who moved to London. And he sort of said, gee, what's the attraction there that we can't have here? On the other hand, Britain is no longer willing to accept any new migrants from Romania and Bulgaria, which are two recent additions to the European Union. So that it's a complicated issue, and to some degree, some of the countries have welcomed this migration, and some countries have resisted it, and some countries that welcomed it are now resisting it for reasons that, similar to the problems that we have, that we discuss all the time in this country. The internal flows within the European Union are probably beginning to slow very rapidly because there has been such an outmigration from Eastern Europe, and the rate of economic growth has been so rapid in Eastern Europe that wages are rising very rapidly, and the outflow is beginning to slow down very significantly. One of the things that economists like to think of is the way the market sometimes solves problems by itself. And in this case, some of the solutions to those big movements within the European Union are beginning to resolve themselves. Just like, for example, there's an outflow of Irish from this country back to Ireland because Ireland has been such an extraordinary economic success over the last 20 or 30 years. Then we get to the more sensitive kind of migration, which is migration from outside the European Union into the European Union, mostly illegal. And that has been largely resisted with some success and some failure by the European countries. Spain and Italy, which are at the sort of the borders of the European Union, have been the most, have received the most in migrants from other countries. And a lot of them have come through and are living. Spain has a lot of illegal migrants in that sense. But they keep trying to stop. You must read the stories about the people from West Africa trying to get to the Canary Islands, which are technically part of Spain. Once you get to the Canary Islands, you're inside the European Union, and then you have a different story, and the navies try to stop that sort of thing. But there has been a lot of, as I said, there's been an enormous amount of movement within Europe. In Switzerland, for example, 24% of the population are foreign-born, which kind of shocked me when I read that. In Belgium, it's 12%. I've read stories that said that in the next 10 years, Rotterdam will be over 50% non-native. And they're struggling with their issues, and some of their issues are different from ours, of course, because Europe doesn't have the tradition of absorbing people of various kinds and becoming full-fledged citizens and active participants in society. And we have. Our history is one of in-migrants. And we've absorbed all kinds of people in enormous numbers in the past, and we've been able to do this successfully. I think uniquely in the world. I think it's one of the extraordinary facts about the United States is how well we have absorbed all kinds of people from all kinds of areas, and who've all become Americans. And I think that's, the Europeans are struggling with that whole process. And you know that they have groups of people that have been living in their countries, Germany for example, for 2 or 3 generations that have not been absorbed. I'm not sure how much of that is the German resistance and how much of that is the desire on the part of the Turks in Germany to maintain their separate status. I gather that there's a great tradition in the Turkish communities. You know, the Germans, after World War II, when things finally got organized and their economy expanded rapidly, imported a lot of workers just to work. They didn't think beyond that stage. And many of them were Turks. There's a big Turkish contingent in Germany. And my understanding is that most of those families send back to the old country for wives for their children. So they're all struggling with that problem. And I'm really impressed with the fact that most of those problems have not been anywhere near as severe in this country as they are there. And that, as I say, because we're used to this sort of thing. We do it all the time. There's another aspect, and then we'll move on to the United States, another aspect to in migration to the European Union that they are going to have to wrestle with. Birth rates in the European Union are very low. So low that their populations are beginning to decline, literally beginning to decline. And they're going to be short of workers to the degree to which they want to maintain continuing expansion. And they're going to have to face the issue, do they live with that, or do they accept people from the outside to serve as, serve is not the right word, to participate as workers in their economies. In France, for example, you know, you have to have a fertility rate for women of 2.1 to maintain your population, 2.1 rather than 2.0, because not every child lives to adulthood, not every person who is adult, not every woman who is adult has children. So you have to have a fertility rate of 2.1. In France, the fertility rate is 1.85. In Germany, it's 1.38. In Italy, it's 1.27. You know the stories about the Italian men living with their parents until they're 35 before they get married. Poland is 1.23. And the same thing with Russia, because Russia's not part of the European Union. So they're going to have to face that economic issue. We don't have to face it because for 2 reasons. One of it is that our fertility rate is above 2.1. And the other is, of course, we're getting a lot of immigration, which will expand our workforce as time goes on. In the United States, we have about 38 million residents who are foreign-born. With their U.S.-born children, they reach the number of 60 million. It's a big number. It's a very big number. And of course, you know, the history of this is that we had that enormous wave of migration 100 years ago, on the turn of the century. And then there was the World War I, which slowed it down. And then there was the first quota system restricting immigration in the 1920s. So that in 1910, 15% of the population was foreign-born. In 1920, it was 13%. In 1970, it was 5%. We're now talking about 12% foreign-born today, legal and illegal immigrants. Why are we getting all of this? Well, you know, everybody says it's globalization, except that that doesn't answer, to me, that doesn't answer the question. It puts a name on it. There's a great facility that professionals have of putting names on things as if that explains anything. Globalization itself tells me nothing. But basically, I guess it's because communication and transportation are so improved in the last 50 years so that it's easier to get to other places. It's easier to know what's going on in other places. It's easier to communicate with relatives who are already in other places. And when you're in other places, it's easier to communicate back to your home country. It isn't, the break isn't quite as dramatic, isn't anywhere near as dramatic as it was 100 years ago. I don't know how many of you remember a very lovely picture called How Green Was My Valley. And the end of that, that's a story about a mining family in Wales. And for some reason, the economic future of the community seems to be disappearing. I don't know whether the mines were running out of coal, or there was a strike, or whatever the reason was, and the 4 adult sons of this family decided they finally have to give up and go to the United States. And the scene is very emotional because you really understand that they're probably never going to see their parents again. This was, maybe before they die, they'd come back once. So now, you know, it costs probably $75 to fly back to the Dominican Republic in New York City, which you can do every Christmas if you want, or whatever. In fact, I don't know if you remember, but in the last presidential election in the Dominican Republic, the 2 candidates campaigned in northern Manhattan. The tie was that close. The tie was that close. Further, in addition to what migrants get for themselves, there is the issue, not the issue, there is the fact of immigrant remittances, which are extraordinary these days. The World Bank estimates that about $300 billion a year are sent back from host countries to original countries by people who have moved. And that's an enormous sum. It's much many times larger, for example, than the World Bank's investment portfolio. They're talking about like 30, 40, $50 billion of investment decisions they make to help poor countries improve themselves. We're talking about $300 billion. My understanding is that it's the second largest source of foreign revenue for Mexico. The first being oil, obviously, but the second largest source of foreign reserves, foreign exchange in Mexico is immigrant remittances. And they go to, in large part, to support families back home with money that the migrants are earning and saving in their new countries at much higher levels of income. As low as they may be from our standpoint, they're much higher than they were in home countries. Let me just throw some numbers at you about immigrants in the United States. There were over 10 million immigrants into this country between 2000 and 2007, the last 7 years. Let me just tell you, you see these numbers a lot. Let me just tell you where they come from. The current population survey, which is done every year by the Census Bureau, is a very much larger effort. Let me go back a step. Our basic statistic always are the decennial censuses. But the decennial census, as you know, you get a letter in the mail and you're asked to answer a few questions and you send it back. Current population survey, every person interviewed is interviewed by a live interviewer. So you can ask lots and lots of questions about all kinds of things. The sample in March of 2007 was 200,000. That's an extraordinary size of sample. You know, when we do polls for presidential elections, they do 1,000, and you can get a simple answer, which is pretty good. It's pretty good. But you can't get a complicated answer if you just have 1,000. Most of the data come then from the current population survey of March of 2007, and in which, as I say, they were able to ask lots and lots of detailed questions of people. And they oversampled the immigrants. If I remember, there were 25,000 immigrants in that 200,000 sample, which is an oversample, somewhat an oversample. And that's where basically all our data come from, if you work well with it. Let me go one other side path. The number of illegal immigrants is, no one asks you when you, no interviewer goes into a home and says, are you illegal? That doesn't obviously make any sense. So the estimates of illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, is always an estimate derived in a rather complicated fashion. There have been many surveys, non-governmental surveys. I mean, one of the reasons no one's going to answer that question because the interviewer is a government employee. But there have been many non-governmental surveys which talk to people who are undocumented, and has identified their characteristics, so that you know that most illegal immigrants are young or male, or haven't gone through high school, that sort of thing. And on the basis of those surveys, non-governmental surveys, people have constructed estimating equations in which they say if you're an immigrant and say the age 30, your chances of being illegal are 10%. Just invent a number. And if you haven't gone to high school, and there's another 10% chance, an additional 10% chance of being. And if you are from Mexico, there's an additional 10% chance. So they end up with this estimating equation, and they apply the estimating equation to the characteristics of each of the survey recipients. And they come up with an estimate. The estimate is that more than half of the 11 million illegal immigrants, more than half of the immigrants in the last 7 years, 11 million, over 10 million immigrants are illegal. The volume of immigration is the highest in U.S. history. But of course, it's not the highest relative amount, because 100 years ago, the population was 100 million, and now we're 300 million. So we're talking about something that's somewhat larger than 100 years ago, but not 3 times as large. So we absorb a higher ratio of immigrants to native-born Americans 100 years ago than we are now. But the numbers are the largest we've had in history. Of the 38 million immigrants residing in the United States these days, 1/3 are illegal, and half of the Mexican and Central American immigrants are undocumented. 1/3 of the adult immigrant population has not completed high school, as compared to 8% for the native population. 1/3 lack health insurance. Immigrants and their U.S.-born children account for 3/4 of the rise in uninsured individuals since 1990. Let me repeat that. There's another set of issues I assume we talk about from time to time called healthcare. And in that, one of the things that's being talked about the most, even though I don't think it's the most important question in healthcare, is the number of uninsured. There are a number of other questions which I think are much more serious, and they're not being discussed in this campaign. But the coverage issue is being discussed in this campaign. And there's been a lot of concern, properly, about the fact that the number of people who don't have health, the proportion of people who don't have health insurance is rising. And most of that's accounted for by immigrants. Immigrants account for virtually all of the increase in the U.S. school population in the last 20 years. That's an interesting statistic, too. Most of the immigrant population is mostly concentrated in a handful of states, and that's part of the bigger issue that we'll talk about in a few minutes. 7 states will account for 3/4 of the immigrant population in the United States. The same 7 states account for 64% of the new immigrants, the last 7 years of immigrants. So the population effect in the last 20 years. Don't forget that up until 1980 or late 1970s, there were essentially no illegal immigrants in the United States. All of this has happened in the last 20 or 25 years. I don't mean there was zero, but there was essentially no illegal immigration into the United States before 1975 or 1980, which is why you had that big program for legalizing immigrants in the 1980s at a much lower level than we're talking about now. But clearly that's the single most important effect on the labor market has been the fact that we've introduced 10 million, very cavalier in these numbers obviously, 10 million people, most of whom, a large part of whom never completed high school, who work at the lowest wage levels in their community, and that has restrained the increases in wages at that level for both themselves and include Native Americans. When you read about, as we do all the time now, about increasing inequality, income inequality in the United States, you can't help but realize that part of it is because of this. That we've introduced a large group of people at the low end of a wage distribution, and even if they had no effect upon other people's wages, which they do have, just the arithmetic working out of those statistics would yield an increasing inequality. Okay, that's maybe the negative side of immigration. The positive side, immigrants pay taxes of various kinds, although the proportion of the income tax received from low-income people in this country is very, very small. And a lot of these people being the immigrants I'm talking about, receive earned income tax credit refunds, so that their contribution to the federal government on that level is not very great. But of course, a lot of them pay Social Security. And the interesting thing, which is noted in one of the documents you gave, is that a lot of immigrants are living with false documents in order to get jobs, with false Social Security numbers. And those funds go into the Social Security bank, and then they'll never come out, because those people will never be paid Social Security benefits because they have no proper record within Washington of having paid Social Security taxes. That's an offset. The other offset, and this is not directly talked about very much, but the other offset is that a lot of people are able to buy a lot of things cheaper than they otherwise would. A lot of activities go on in which the cost to the consumer is less than it would if we didn't have 10 million new immigrants. Like it's very much like Walmart. Whenever you think of Walmart from other aspects, Walmart has raised the real income of poor people in this country significantly, because they sell things to them cheaper than they get any other place, so they have more money for other things. And that's really what's happened in this country, is that a lot of activities are being transacted at lower costs than they would if we didn't have these 10 million additional immigrants. And the benefit goes to those people who are buying those services. In fact, if there weren't those 10 million, not only would people have to pay more for those services, all kinds of services, house cleaning services, gardening services, construction. A third of the construction workforce consists of immigrants. There are some places where I've read that all the wallboard installers are immigrants. And a lot of things would not be done. People, if prices were higher, a lot of people would not buy those services, and they would not get the benefit of those services. Maybe there wouldn't be as many nannies around. We'd have to take care of their kids some other way. And that's a benefit to the rest of society. And it's not really, in a sense, a cost to the migrants, because they're living better than they ever lived before. As poor as they may be living compared to like you and I would like to live, they're earning a lot more money than they've ever lived. I think it's wrong to say, sometimes we will hear an argument that immigrants do work that Americans wouldn't do. And I don't think that's a very realistic view. There's some kinds of labor, street labor in California, which maybe doesn't exist much anymore. Maybe it's mostly mechanized now. But that's what the braceros used to come in and do all the time, because you couldn't get Americans to go out into the field and stoop day after day after day to pick the vegetables, tomatoes, or whatever. But other than something like that, the activities of immigrants are exactly the same as others. They do in the same industries, and there are lots of Americans in the same industries doing the same kinds of things. The only effect, as I say, is on the level of wages. Okay, let me go to one last thing before I stop pontificating. All of this doesn't deal with what I think is the elephant in the living room. which is the question of assimilation. Really, I think the passion involved in the discussions as you hear them is because, let me read you a sentence from, this is a book that you were reading, was Reinventing the Melting Pot by Tamar, edited by Tamar. And there's some blurbs on the back cover that always are. And one of them says, although the debate is too frequently captured by bean counters and economists, the issue of immigration and assimilation is probably the most important one we face. I wonder why economists always get these sort of dry, deprecatory comments. We do it to ourselves a lot. Our teaching course in economics, I was introducing the subject by saying the latest aphorism I had heard about economists was, an economist is someone who is very good with numbers, but doesn't have the personality to be an accountant. Anyway, put that aside. The issue of assimilation, I think, is really what engenders the passion of this. And the fear, legitimate or not, you can judge for yourself, is that the current wave of immigration will not assimilate as readily as prior waves of assimilation. Now, that's a very complicated issue because, you know, this is not the first time it's been heard in the history of the country. Ben Franklin complained about all those Germans coming into the country 200 years ago. And, you know how the Irish were received in Boston, and the groups of Italians and Jews during around 1900 were received in the same way. One of the difference, though, is when Julia Richmond was superintendent of schools in New York City, she knew what her job was. Her job was to take these children of immigrants and teach them English and tell them about George Washington and make them Americans. 30 or 40 years ago in this country, there was a very great revision in public consciousness about the way in which you do that now. You know, the development of multiculturalism, his idea was that to be mean-spirited and cruel to kids to take them away from their family's culture. And there's a very serious thought out there that maybe we're not doing as work of a job in achieving this goal as we used to do, for reasons that people think are perfectly valid. I'll just remind you that when there were 2 demonstrations last year when the immigration bill was being discussed in the Senate, and the very first set of demonstrations across the country by Hispanics, essentially, because that's the area that we're dealing with now. There were a lot of Mexican flags being carried. They didn't do it in the second demonstration. I think their sponsors said that wasn't a very good idea. But that's the issue, I think, that sort of is unresolved. It's easier to have ties now with your home country than it used to be, and does that have an effect upon the degree to which assimilation will result in the same as it did 100 years ago, if that's the goal that you want? So that unanswered question, I think.
Very good. Thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about, and I know that there are lots of questions.
I have 2 questions. One is, apropos Rositas, weren't there a group of agricultural laborers coming in out of Mexico for the last 100 years called something like... Yes. And then the second question is, this book at your right hand, is this a book you have written?
No. This is a book edited by Tamar Jacoby, who's a great expert in quotes on immigration, writes a lot about immigration. And it's a set of essays by all kinds of people about all kinds of issues. It's an interesting book. You might be interested. Well written. I found it very interesting. No, we've had agricultural laborers come in from Mexico for many years. Started World War II, and but they were temporary immigrants. They were told to go back. Ultimately, most of them did go back. And Canada's facing the same problem. The Canadian immigration system, immigration laws, give great preference to either A, advanced degrees or advanced skills, or lots of money. If you have lots of money, you can become a citizen of Canada. If you have a PhD in mathematics, you can become, again, they're more complicated than that, but basically, that's what they've done. But the problem in Canada, as you might know, is that economy is booming. But it's booming in the west half of Canada, not in the eastern half of Canada. And the western half of Canada needs a different kind of immigrant. So they need somebody to build those, work on those tar sands in Alberta, or to work in the lumber business, and so on. And they have a system of temporary workers that they are allowing to come in for 1 year. Really, they go back. I don't know, how much they go back. I don't know. But they're struggling with that sort of thing. In a sense, what I really guess I've learned as a result of looking into this is that in many places of the world, people are facing exactly the same questions we're facing. And the situation is somewhat different, and the history is somewhat different. And that's like the one thing I think that distinguishes this country is the fact that we're an immigrant country, in a sense. Except for the Indians, everybody came here at one time. And with all the problems we've had, and all the difficulties we've had, and all the mistreatment we've had of some immigrants, we've been able to come through it. And I'm personally very optimistic. I'm a great optimist about the future, unlike lots of people for whom the sky is always falling. I'm always remonstrating at the output of the group that we go to, that really Chicken Little is not the proper attitude that we can have in the world. Life really is getting better, it's not getting worse. And I'm really very optimistic, but I think we have this great tradition. And if the immigrant population who are more, I didn't really get into this, but the reason that this is such a sensitive issue is because they are concentrated in some areas. And the numbers are large in those areas. If they were more evenly distributed, the intensity of the discussion, I think, would be reduced. And the burdens are not equally distributed. North Dakota really doesn't have a problem with immigrants. Arizona has a very big problem with immigrants in a variety of ways. And the sensitivity of this issue and the intensity of the passions of this issue are much greater in the areas where 30 or 40% of the population are immigrant population.
I feel like, I'm sorry, just something you just said, I also feel like it's about race. I mean, I think that's the one thing that isn't being said in our own form that we've been doing. The issue that doesn't come up as much, we keep it very focused on immigration, is that I think a lot of, when you said 13% in New York State, it's not that big of a deal. It is a big deal in this area, and after what Spitzer did, and I think it's based on race.
Absolutely. I didn't mean to.
I'm not saying you did. I'm just saying I feel like racism isn't talked about as much with this issue.
But what is it about this? Some of it is simply, and it's always been true, is the strangeness of the stranger. I understand that. It's always been true. But I really think that there's a very serious concern on the part of lots of people, deserved or not, that we have a different kind of immigrant population now, and will they become like your next door neighbors? And I don't have a good answer to that. Can I just make one more comment? In response to that comment, I will often hear statements which are valid in and of themselves, which are that by the third generation, you can't tell the difference. The problem is that those data, and assuming we're doing work with data now, not just with guesses, is that the third generation people came here 50 years ago. They're not exactly the same people. On the other hand, one last comment. I think one of the things that is changing rapidly and is offsetting this concern that you and I are talking about is the extraordinary intermarriage rate. 50% of the Asian women in California do not marry Asian men. Now, it sort of blows my mind when I use that statistic. It's incredible. It's incredible. And I think there's so much of that going on. You know that there's a large group, by large I mean we're talking about a number of millions of people, who in the year 2000 refused to identify themselves as race, for a particular race, because they said my parents are two different races. And that number is growing. And some of that is going to offset the concern about the strangeness of the stranger. But I don't have answers for it. know, I don't know what the answer to all these things are, but you're absolutely right that you know, had these been you know, Belgians, the 10 million people were Belgian immigrants, there would have been a different view than there are with the Mexicans. It's a fact of life.
Okay. I sort of have a two-part question. One is to put in context the outflow of immigrant money to their home countries vis-a-vis the weakened U.S. dollar, and you know what is the impact of the immigrant population and how the money is flowing out of our country rather than staying here. And the second part of it is the difference in our attitude toward or ability to assimilate these populations part of the reason that that money is flowing out, and what can we do policy-wise to encourage assimilation so that we don't have this feeling of us and them, or
you know that the word assimilation was a four-letter word. So I mean, I used it, and you're using it, but that was 30 or 40 years ago. That was not the chattering class's view of the way this assimilation should be done. This book is entitled "Reinventing the Melting Pot," and I think the issue has come back to the fore. I don't look. The outflow of immigrant remittances is a number in the balance of payments to the United States, but it's not a big number. We had, last year, I guess we had an adverse balance of payments in the current account of $800 billion. I would assume that immigrant remittances are on the order of what, 20 or 30 billion. So it's not a big item. It works against us.
A billion here and a billion there.
Sorry?
A billion here and a billion there.
Maybe we can balance our budget.
I'll tell you something that's not relevant to this, but I did some work, I did some sort of class on balance of payments just a few weeks ago at the community college. I was kind of shocked. The biggest item in our adverse balance of payments is merchandise trade. We buy a lot more than we sell. That's changing some right now, just the low value, the declining value of the dollar. The next largest balance, which offsets that, are services. We get a plus balance of about $80 billion. And when I read that in the table, I sort of said to myself, services, we're talking banking services, legal services. The largest item in that number is medical services. People coming to this country to get medical care and paying dollars for the medical care. And the second largest are foreign students coming to American universities and paying dollars for tuition. I didn't realize. The balance. You really need another 6 hours.
Sorry.
I don't think it's a significant amount. There, but it's not a major factor.
And if we assimilate the populations, would it
Well, I suppose that'll
keep the
slow
money
down.
here?
Out in time, that would slow down.
One last question, Elsa.
Talking about, I had another question, but now that we're talking about assimilation, I just want to make a comment. If assimilation means that you are going to forget your roots, I don't want to. I don't want that. I want my children and my nieces and nephews to remember where they came from, to learn their language, to learn about the Mayan Indians, go back to their native country and enjoy that. And so in this age of transportation and communication, you don't have to give that up. I think years ago when people came from Europe in a boat, it was hard to go back, that was justified, but not any longer. And nobody has to give up their roots.
There's the issue.
Last question. I think we're going to thank Dr. Blank. We've exhausted and he's exceeded our expectations and took his assignment very seriously. Not at all. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming. Stop by, take some